So what I'm doing today is not a polemical exercise. I'm not advancing an argument or a particular approach. We're all in the same struggle together. So we come together not as theoretical rivals or competing over some tradition. We're in this together. We're partners, we're collaborators, we're allies in trying to forge together the tools that we need, intellectual, communicational, organizational, to resist this deadly imposition of neoliberal measures and values on the world today. And that's how I'm approaching the session today. This is what's on the menu. We're in the unknown at the moment. And as number 5 says, we're back into the unknown in a little bit. But I wanted to talk about COVID-19 in the UK, something about theory and practice, something about the current interventions in the present situation, socialism of the hour, and then back into the unknown. And I think we can share some observations and reflections on these commitments. As linguists, of course, as well as activists, we know that progressive social movements are at once struggles for foundational economic, political and social change, and at the same time necessarily struggles over language, about language, in language, and for language which enables and promotes the consciousness and organization upon which such transformation depends. So I'm going to open up with some thoughts of my own and then invite people to contribute their experiences, perhaps add or counterpose from your own struggle at the moment. For me, it's been a very hectic time that's been split between academic and professional work on the one hand, and participation and contribution in political and trade union work of different kinds at the same time. And because of that, it's been interesting, sometimes problematic, to work on and think about the connections between these different aspects of my life, as well as the connections to daily family life, to daily working life, and just generally try to cope in the situation. And the main things academically I've been concentrating on are 2 things, which I'll talk about in a little while. The first is, in fact, a co-authored article with 𝗪𝗔, building on her work and that of her colleagues Fernanda Liberali and others, thinking about interventions in educational practice, and also a review with colleagues of the book by Anastasenko, which 𝗪𝗔 also mentioned. There have been other things I've been working on as well, but those have been the main things I think that have informed some of the intellectual debates I've been having with myself, and also relate perhaps most closely to the practical political stuff. On the political side, broadly speaking, I've been involved in general political trade union and Labour Party work, pro-Palestinian activism, which is an important thing at the moment, and also union organisation within my own university context. And a lot of this work has been done in collaboration with an old friend and colleague of mine, Chick Collins, and Marjorie McCrory from the University of West of Scotland. And I'll talk about that in a bit. One of the most different things about the crisis is that we did try, as 𝗪𝗪 explained, we did try to intervene in the struggle in the UK on the national level in terms of organisation, political resistance to the UK government. I have to say that intervention completely failed, but it has some interest, which I will talk about perhaps in a little bit. The COVID crisis in the UK. It's fair to say that there's been criminal and catastrophic mismanagement of the crisis by the UK government. Although the British establishment and media have largely managed so far to keep the show on the road, as they usually do. And this mishandling continues. As you can see from that graph, it's not a great picture. Those are statistics about the deaths from COVID-19. And you can see that it doesn't look as if it's going down very much, does it? And if we look at the next chart, you'll see as well that we're certainly nowhere near the end of this story at the moment. There are at least 45,000 people who've died, and that's the official figure. The unofficial figure is probably more like 60 to 70,000. In fact, until very recently, the UK was in second place behind the United States for numbers of deaths. And it gives me no pleasure to note that Brazil has now overtaken the UK. What I think does seem clear is that those regimes in the world which have most aggressively embraced neoliberal policies and values have been least able and willing to lead an effective society-wide mobilization and response to the virus. And of course, they care least about the people who've suffered and died. So more generally, the pandemic has ignited a global war over public health and social equality. It's dramatically heightened the exposure of the general failure of contemporary capitalist society to ensure common well-being. And it's shone even more light on the debilitating impact of neoliberal public management, privatization, and austerity on the public sector, on healthcare infrastructure, and on wider living conditions. It's also heightened recognition of the stark inequalities and indeed inhumanities of different nations, different states, and UK Tory-led Britain for one. One thing that became immediately clear, oh sorry, I forgot to show you this picture. That was Bournemouth Beach over the weekend. Yeah, so although there are about 200 people dying a day still in the UK, that's a picture of the beach. Yeah, so you can see that, yeah, the government's really sending the right message and got things under control. So of course, this is the whole mismanagement of the crisis has led to serious political crisis and resistance. This you can see here is particularly about the lack of healthcare equipment. This is for frontline workers. This is for doctors, nurses, and others who work on the front line. But the inequalities have been raised in other ways. So, for example, it became very clear that a disproportionate number of doctors, nurses, and healthcare workers from Black and minority ethnic communities and families were dying on the front line. Black and ethnic minority workers from communities constitute 60% of the deaths of frontline healthcare workers. So that is a demonstration of a very severe fact about the inequalities in British society. Now, of course, at the same time, we've seen the explosion internationally of the Black Lives Matter movement in response to the killing of George Floyd by the Minneapolis police. Part of what we might call an uprising against racial violence and injustice in the UK was the pulling down of statues dedicated to prominent slave owners or those who profited from the slave trade. And this is the statue of a slave trader called Edward Colston in Bristol. This statue was torn down and thrown into the river. Now here, of course, Britain has a particular role in history as one of the main organizers and beneficiaries of the slave trade as a colonial power. And as this next slide shows, an important development is the coalescence of the Black Lives Movement with other movements, in particular the support for the Palestinian people. So Black Lives Matter, Palestinian Lives Matter. And so the struggle against racist violence and inequality in the UK has merged dramatically with the powerful ongoing movement, the pro-Palestinian movement, and also the movement for the decolonisation of education, decolonisation of schools, the school curriculum, and universities and university curricula. For those who work in universities, of course, this gives us a very particular and unique responsibility and concerns. Colonial exploitation and violence is not a thing of the past, it's not a mere legacy. As William Jamal Richardson explains, Eurocentric institutions, including the university, were all midwifed into existence by the actual physical deaths of colonized people. And so the core mechanism by which we can begin to disrupt these processes of structural Eurocentrism is by ensuring that colonized and marginalized people don't die. It's not often that social scientists, he says, talk about death outside of it being a research finding or observation, but it indeed stalks our struggle as scholars to challenge Eurocentric institutions. And the point is particularly telling in the context of investments and partnerships that UK universities have with particular nations, including the settler colonial state of Israel. As Dalia Gabriel puts it in a marvelous essay on Rhodes Must Fall, the movement can't only be about students and claim an analytic framework of decoloniality. It's crucial for any student and academic-led decolonization movement, not only to rigorously understand and define its terms, but also to locate the university as just one node in a network of spaces where this kind of struggle must be engaged with. Such a movement, she says, also needs to understand its position as responding to live issues of inequality, colonialism, and oppression, rather than just being a matter of legacies or unearthing historical accounts for the sake of it. To do this kind of work in the university is to dig where you are, where you have access, rather than to view the university itself as a primary space where transformation happens. It's to enter the university space as a transformative force to connect what's happening inside the institution to the outside and to utilize its resources in the interests of social justice. And of course, beyond the COVID-19 crisis is the climate crisis. I won't say any more about that at this stage, but I think it does the global response to the coronavirus does give us important lessons that this climate crisis, we can tackle it. It gives us a possibility, at least shows us a possibility of concerted action for the planet, and lessons about that and the difficulties that that faces. Everything depends on how far we're able to turn those lessons and the experiences of this global action at the moment into meaningful transformative measures on a world scale. And so this struggle that we're in for the most basic human principles and for the collective good has exposed all the fault lines and inequalities of society. But at the same time, it's shown us where the value is, what is worth what. It's shown us the interconnections, the interdependencies between all of the positive forces for good in the world, the people who actually do the work, the people who care for others, the value of life, the value of liberty and the pursuit of happiness. The forces for good are there, but we need organization. We need to bring that collective power into focus and bring it to bear. And that's an organizational, a political, of course, and a communicational matter. In terms of theory and practice, as I said, it was particularly significant for me to be working on two collaborative pieces of writing. The first was a piece that 𝗪𝗂 and I had agreed to write following the December meetings in Sao Paulo, 𝗪𝗂, 𝗪𝗲𝗂𝗂 and Freire, methodological discussions on the role of language in social transformation. Our basic aim was to offer a Marxist grounding for a particular dialogical praxis within the liberatory, critical, collaboratory tradition of problem-posing education in various terms, and consider its implications in realizing the potential role of the school as a site of cultural synthesis within a transforming social totality. And the paper drew on fundamental principles of Marx's materialist conception of history, concretized through the educationally based dialogical approaches of Vygotsky and Freire, as well as the recent attempt at a new synthesis of these intellectual currents in 𝗂𝗪𝗪𝗃𝗀𝗁's transformative activist stance. I'll return to that paper below, but I think it's also useful to mention the way that we referred specifically to Marx's contribution, something that I've been thinking about a lot. Marx himself was an opponent of narrow and doctrinaire economistic thinking, and the staunchest supporter of any and all attempts to improve working conditions and practices, as well as conditions of life generally, within the framework of existing exploitative relations of production. Any humane measure which would encroach on and limit the demands and dominance of capital, such as compulsory education or legal or constitutional enshrinements of basic rights, was taken as a positive step towards the affirmation and assertion of human values, of universal human potential. And indeed, because of the all-sided interconnections and interactions between forms of social activity, any struggle on any front, however small scale, offered scope for a contest of political aims and priorities. Similarly, any achievements made in struggle, material or ideological, created staging posts for wider and deeper social change and transformation. So from Marx's perspective, the struggle against exploitation is one to be carried out on all fronts and may begin anywhere, since all challenges to the status quo can become, in Harvey's words, the co-revolutionary points around which social action could converge and rotate. Enter the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, within weeks, it transpires that all the relations and structures of the contemporary global capitalist economy are completely negotiable. Certainly what happened in the UK was that all that was required was a widespread, spontaneous public revulsion against a policy that implied hundreds of thousands of people dying for the well-being of corporate capitalism, and everything changed in the government in terms of money being spent, huge amounts of money being given out. Of course, the fundamental task, the principal task, and the fundamental communicational challenge is how to unite the disparate and often fragmented struggles and outbursts into a single powerful movement. The COVID-19 crisis has made that unity necessary. And also amidst its deadly dangers, it provides an enormous opportunity to achieve these things. Another collaboration then was the review that Chick Collins, Marjorie McCrory and I did of 𝗂𝗪𝗪𝗃𝗀𝗁's book. I know many of you are familiar with that, with Anna's work, so I'm not going to do a detailed exposition of it, but just to fix on certain passages, both from our review and from her work. It was interesting for us to be working on that review at this time. And I hope in some way we were able perhaps even to contribute to that work and to amplify its relevance in this particular context. Let me take a few passages. Importantly, Anna says, the social change and transformation enacted in the movement beyond the given is taken to be no less and in fact more real than what is often believed is the abstract and neutral brute reality of the world as it exists now, in its seemingly unalterable givens and facts. It's the process of co-creating, co-authoring, and inventing the future, all embodied in the struggle to change the world and the ways in which it's shaping us. In the acts of taking a stand, staking a claim, making a commitment, and claiming a position, and thus coming to know and to exist while working and laboring to realize them. That is rendered foundational to human development and subjectivity. And in our review, as we put it, trying to capture the sense of what she was saying, that social reality as a solid, stable, recalcitrant system of impersonal structure, blocking the road to a better future, is, she insists, an illusion, a highly and in the present moment evidently fragile result of the temporary channeling of our collective transformative powers into destructive and self-destructive practices, serving the few, not the many. What reality is then ultimately depends on our understanding of and our commitment to our own creative and transformative powers. The reality that appears to get in the way of desired goals is in fact an unrecognized product of our own activity, a reified projection of our own powers, for the time being misdirected in unhelpful ways that we can actually change. And in this light, it also becomes apparent that the aforementioned weight of disciplinary tradition in the social sciences, premised on notions of responsiveness, reactivity, adaptability, reproduction, appropriation, assimilation, rather than the creative, active, transformative, and self-transformative reality of collective human endeavor, reflects precisely this reified reality. So Stetsenko begins by explaining that the theoretical challenge is not that concerns with social change and human agency in producing it are entirely absent from contemporary accounts of development in mind. Rather, it is that these should be more than matters of concern. What picture results, she asks, if change and transformation and human agency in instigating them, rather than stability and finished orderliness of the world in its status quo to which people actively adapt? What if change and transformation and human agency are taken as the guiding principles and foundational principles? Premises, what indeed? And in this approach, human relations to the world are always on the cusp between what has been, what is, and what is about to be, in the gap between what exists in the present, as the present continuously carries on the past, and what is sought after in the future. To relate to the world in activist ways means to act in light of its ongoing, continuous, and ever-shifting challenges, opportunities, problems, and affordances, while always focusing on what's coming about and is to be done next, as per one's imagination and striving. So perhaps the main thing is to understand then that the future is being built by us now. The world we will inhabit, perhaps the world we want, is a matter of how we act in the present, how we co-create right now the communicational, the organizational resources, the tools and proficiencies to help steer us, direct us towards that hoped-for future. And when I was thinking about this, and preparing the talk, I looked back on some unpublished work I'd done more than 20 years ago about, I guess, what you might call critical communication studies. And I'll quote from that now. It's a notebook written in 1998. And I was thinking about the time about ethnographic and work and conversation analysis work. And I was dissatisfied with them for a number of reasons. I said the social process responsible for this activity, including the technology and them as trained workers, is left out of account, and the activity is studied in the same way that one would study a religious ritual. In fact, the one looks like the other, because the connections between language and thinking, theory and practice, activity and social process are left out of account. So what to do then? Clearly, one must study those activities in which the participants themselves are forced to critically confront their practices and their thinking, and in that way forced to penetrate to and confront the constraints and limitations of the social order itself, as it directly impinges on them, and to elaborate the means, theoretical and practical, to overcome these limitations, determinations, and constraints. Human essence lies not in the use of tools, in ritualized, uncritically accepted activity, but in the creative invention and critical overcoming of existing practices and limitations, going beyond the existing. In other words, look for cases where the social order, class, capital and its limits, the social relations of production, is confronted by people in the course of their actual living practice. Such a critical analysis, in distinction from critical discourse analysis, would focus precisely on those forms and means by which the existing social order is problematized, the ways in which the limitations of the existing social order become an issue for actual practice and the development of theory to guide practice, where people overcome or go beyond their existing roles, for example, while staying a consumer of the National Health Service, becoming a critic of the National Health Service reforms, an activist. So this is a process whereby we can really study the relationship between language and thinking, discourse and social structure and so on. In the actual experiences of people coming face to face with the problems and limitations, the disastrous, catastrophic and murderous nature of the social order. In the article that 𝗪𝗂 and I wrote, we tried to address the communicational organization of this relating to the world in transformative activist ways. As we said, the radical politico-economic transformation of society involves organization of progressive social actors on a mass scale. Such organization requires its own communicational practices, cultural action in Frere's terms, as a break with the alienating practices of the exploitative past and present. And so in this work, we were examining the potential of dialogical action for opening up to conscious critique and transformation, the very modes of communication and organization through which institutional schooling, banking education, is usually constituted. And we were arguing that given the contradictory character of all social institutions within a social order, a conflictual social order based on class struggle, the socio-communicative regime of the school, ostensibly imposed to fragment and alienate the oppressed, in fact also offers a transformable platform for critical contestation and organization for social revolution. And we focus particularly on dialogue as the core practice for critical collaboration between teachers and students in working out how to construct a unity of social forces directed towards humanization. And we added, from that point of view, the dialogical practices within the school must be seen in their future-oriented, synergistic contribution to the transformability of that dynamic and constantly emergent network, what Fernando Liberal has called a creative chain of interconnected and interconstituting communication processes, of which social reality actually consists. A further collaboration with Chick Collins involved us, as 𝗪𝗂 mentioned earlier, actually trying to respond to the unfolding COVID-19 crisis in the UK with a proposal to try and unite the labour movement, the whole labour movement and popular movement, into a single organised force to challenge the whole governance of the crisis in the UK and to try and wrest the civil society leadership away from the Conservative government. And we called the idea a People's HQ for COVID-19. This wasn't a socialist programme, it wasn't a set of demands or aspirations or a blueprint for a future society. No, it wasn't a plan for something after the crisis. It was a battle plan for the crisis now, for organising the present for the future. And as we put it, the message of the People's HQ will be simple. The Tories have failed to protect the UK population and its health service, and we don't trust them to lead us safely through the crisis. The labour movement must unite to help save lives in the immediate and begin to steer the strategic management of the crisis towards a longer-term economic and social settlement that benefits the many, not the few. I won't go through all the details of the analysis, but our point was that making the case for socialism in the future is all well and good, but there's also a more important and urgent socialism of the hour, which is not about when the COVID crisis is all over, but how we organise during the crisis to assert the political independence and leadership capacity of the labour movement itself. And we suggested this idea of a people's HQ. The main, I won't go into all the details, but the main point was for the labour movement and the popular movement to find its independent voice and to start to feel its own strength, its own message, and to find the organisational means to get that message across and to organise independently of the government and to try to effect and exercise a capacity for leadership exactly where it was required in the face of the total catastrophic mismanagement by the Tory government. Now, as I mentioned before, the proposal failed, let's say, failed to receive widespread support, let's put it that way. Though it was discussed and debated. And of course, the story's not over yet. If I trouble you with it, it's partly because it was a failure so far, and what lessons we might learn from that. But it's also perhaps useful because of one important thing that happened quite independently of the work that we did. While we were writing and arguing our case, a real concrete alliance between trade unions and the wider popular movement was emerging. The battleground became the schools. The Conservative government was wanting to open up the schools again to children in England, send the children back to school a long time before there was any sign of the virus being under control. But the National Education Union, on the basis, this is the teachers' union, on the basis of its own independent scientific advice and wide consultation with its members, said no. They defied the government instruction. They had their own tests for safe reopening of schools, which weren't met. And they took this fight out to the broader trade union movement, to local councils, to parents' organisations, parents' groups and community organisations. They brought enormous support. And in fact, the government had to back down. It was a stunning example of creative communicational organisation of a popular resistance movement, taking on the unassailable moral high ground of life and health, and using that to mobilize on a mass scale to resist the government and to create an alternative leadership. The National Education Union became the leading force in deciding how this crisis was being managed. It became the center of attraction for an embryonic united resistance movement. And it's precisely that exercising of the organized power to lead which is decisive for the social change and revolution we need to make. That was one of the conferences that the National Education Union, together with the People's Assembly, organized. And at one Zoom meeting of the National Education Union, they had nearly 20,000 attendees. They were also very quick to make a broad alliance with the Black Lives Matter movement and others championing the cause of the ethnic minority communities and so on, and bringing all these struggles together. Back into the unknown, friends. The COVID crisis is not over. Far from it. The World Health Organization tells us that in fact it's accelerating globally. What challenges and opportunities this will present for us, we can't know for sure. But we do know that we have the potential to solve this and to change our lives for the better. The potential is there if we can realize it. And so on the matter of potential, I turn for the last time in closing to our review of Anna Stetsenko's wonderful book. People have infinite potential, she says, a potential that resides in the active relations between individuals, their communities and society generally. That potential can only be made real by serious action to dismantle the social and cultural barriers to equal development, overcoming present inequalities and genuinely promoting equal rights for all. Human potential, consequently, is not a fixed set of limits or boundaries on our capacities, which can be discovered and studied, but something to fight for against all odds and against all obstacles. It's a challenge to all of us to struggle to create those conditions in which all people may rise to the promise that their humanity offers. I thank you.